exceedingly kind introduction. Thank you very much. Hi everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. I think also I think give a talk in a space with lots of wonderful thinkers, colleagues, and also friends here. I'll share my slides so we can get started talking about bicycles. All right. So today, I recently came upon this bicycle metaphor, especially this training wheels metaphor. And today I want to share some of our more recent work around human AI collaboration and to improve learning and human learning, that is, even though I think there's lots of parallels to machines learning as well. And I started using this training wheel metaphor specifically, and this I really like this training wheel metaphor for how we can use AI or language models to help us learn certain skills. And I like this metaphor because training wheels are supposed or typically are removed eventually. And I think in all of our current AI excitement that in many ways I share, I think we forget about this sometimes. So today I want to talk about especially learning of skills that are particularly relevant to our mental health. But much of what I will show you is really not too specific just to mental health. It generalizes to other skills, social skills, communication skills, and I'll come back to that at the very end. All right, so clearly there's been tremendous advances in AI over the past few years. And in some sense, we now have machines that at least to kind of some sense, some definition, they listen to you, they respond to you, they can translate between languages, they can solve at least some problems, they can learn, they can retrieve information, seemingly express emotion. And that used to be science fiction. As maybe some in the room here know, C3PO was famously fluent in over 6 forms of communications, and machines are getting closer and closer to that today. And usually here, I would do a quick poll for anybody who's awake and active on Zoom. Maybe you can share a reaction. Some of us have learned how to ride bicycles, and I'm curious, and maybe to get us awake, I'd be curious to see maybe like a thumbs up or something like that. Who has learned how to ride a bicycle and used training wheels for that? Or perhaps use that for your own children. Apparently there's even bicycle emojis. This is a specced out Zoom room. That's fantastic. And maybe to follow up on that, I'd be curious how many people still use those training wheels today. I think I remember seeing you bike around campus, Michael, and I believe that was a no training wheel scenario, and like that makes a lot of sense. Like that is not always done, but training wheels can be super helpful, but usually for a period of time. And initially, these are really helpful, scaffolding in some sense. They help us to learn a skill of riding a bike. They make this practice a little easier. We have to maybe focus on a few less things, and kind of the perfect balance comes a little later. They help us learn a skill and make this practice safer. So in some sense, I would argue that biking with training wheels is a little easier. And I want to point out that sometimes in order to learn a skill, we make things harder as well. And it's a little hard to see, but this person here in front of this picturesque background is running at altitude with a weighted vest. So this is something, like maybe they're training for a competition near sea level, but it's an entirely reasonable thing in the spirit of learning to make things harder. And we often call this idea desirable difficulties, that difficulties might actually be desirable, and there's lots of meaning in the difficulty and in the friction that help us learn and train. And today I want to focus on some skills that I think are just really, really important. They are skills that help us improve our relationships, our interactions with others, our mental health. Who knows? My hope is that they ultimately also contribute to help maintain a healthy democracy as well. And I'll now introduce some of those skills. One key skill is empathy. By that, I mean the ability to understand or share the emotions and experiences of others. Another one is emotional regulation. This is the ability to manage and express emotions appropriately. This is our beloved dog, Lacey. Lacey and I are both working on emotional regulation, and we often do that together. Another critical skill is conflict resolution. Like this is the ability to address disagreements constructively. Conflict is very, very normal, but it's good to have healthy ways of dealing with it. And the final one I won't point out, but I'm sure we could keep going, is the skill of cognitive flexibility or reappraisal. Being able to be open to new information, being willing to change your mind, for example, in the face of new evidence, being able to challenge your existing views and perspectives. When I think about whether kind of as a society we're getting better at these skills, I'm not entirely sure. But I do want to acknowledge that learning these skills and exercising these skills can actually be deeply challenging, deeply uncomfortable, actually painful. So why aren't we outsourcing all these things to some AI model? If it's so painful, why don't we let somebody else do it? And of course, I'm kidding, but it's actually something I'm quite concerned about. We increasingly see more and more kind of AI assistants in our life that help with lots of things. And they can be kind of particularly convenient. They tend to be very, very agreeable. We've increasingly started it. They can be, they try so hard to be helpful that they can be pathologically helpful to a degree that's actually harmful. And in general, I worry that this technology could perhaps too much reinforce our existing beliefs or biases and not challenge us and our beliefs enough. And if you're not sure about how agreeable these models are, when I prepared for this talk on a Tuesday. I just happened to put into one of our, a particular popular language model, hey, I think Tuesdays are absolutely the worst days of the week. Don't you agree? And shockingly, the language model agreed with me on somewhat particularly arbitrary. I actually cut off the quote here because I'm not comfortable putting everything on the slide, but they vehemently agreed with whatever random beliefs I put in front of it. Now, if we actually want to learn important skills, how would we do that? And thankfully, there's a ton we can build on from education and learning theory. It's very reasonable to start with some scaffolding, to begin by understanding a given task through some form of guided support and structure. We might then move on to deliberate practice, practicing specific areas where we need improvement, using some guidance from scaffolding to do this purposefully and intentionally. And then finally, we might integrate constructive feedback, whether that's during practice sessions or after practice sessions. We can use it to refine our practice, to improve our performance, and potentially return to practice with this feedback in mind. And I believe, and this is really the core hypothesis behind lots of our current research, is that language, and therefore also language models, can provide the scaffolding and this practice and this feedback really to create new opportunities for learning. And I want to illustrate this hypothesis with two recent projects. And in each project, we will teach some important skills through some form of AI-supported scaffolding and practice and feedback. But then we will measure performance without those training wheels. They're meant to come off, and that's why I'm trying to use this metaphor here. And I want to discuss how to design human-AI interactions that actually empower users to transition from this AI reliance to actual mastery of the skills that they're acquiring. Really trying to ensure that this AI support really is more of a stepping stone than a crutch. And one way to see this is really that ultimately we're designing AI support here with planned obsolescence in mind. And the hope is that some version of this will lead to more effective and sustained learning outcomes. And I, especially at Stanford HCI, I feel like I might be preaching a little bit to the choir today. As so often, this talk will focus primarily on work I've personally been involved in. I just want to say that we're very excited and thankful for so much of the awesome work that's happening around you in this space. There's thousands of people that we could reference over and over again, but whether that's work from, I don't know, Dean, Michael, James, Emma, Omar, Matthew, Dora, Hari, Rose, and many friends here on the Zoom call as well. While I won't refer to your awesome work as much during this talk, it does hold a very special place in our minds and hearts. And with that, I'll share about this first skill about reframing negative thoughts. And I like doing this by introducing Nathaniel. Nathaniel took this picture willingly with consent as part of a really awesome art campaign. And he was one of the individuals that shared his personal story in this art campaign called Let's Talk. And as you can see here, the artists really powerfully express his inner reality as lettering on his face. And I'm showing you this because it illustrates, I think, really well that we all have negative thoughts. We express them through language, even if we don't make it as explicit as the artists perhaps do here. But I think it's really that so much about our psychology we process and express through language that really get me excited about opportunities to use, for instance, language model technology and develop that specifically for mental health purposes. So as I mentioned, it's pretty common to experience negative thoughts. I'll pick on myself now, but I hope that at least some of you can relate to this. And it happens to me pretty often. And I like to tell my students that nobody has been rejected more often than myself. But it happens to me quite regularly that I submit something and it might get rejected. And this can lead to thoughts like, I'll never succeed as a researcher. And these thoughts are quote unquote just thoughts, but they really matter. For instance, they matter because they relate to our feelings and our behaviors. Like thoughts like this are often followed for me with self-doubt or frustration, maybe relates to some behaviors that are not in my best interests in the end, and often creates this vicious cycles of negative feelings, behaviors, and thoughts. But it's really difficult to challenge them. They're often entrenched and automatic. These thoughts can be emotionally triggering. But thankfully, there's kind of a well-established, proven therapeutic techniques to overcome these negative thoughts, to challenge them, which is called cognitive reframing. And the core idea is just that we can challenge this negative thought, I'll never succeed as a researcher, with a more balanced, more helpful, reframed thought. For instance, this could be something like, well, it's normal to feel disappointed when a paper gets rejected. I can use this experience to learn and grow. And this is really at the core of cognitive behavioral therapy, the form of therapy that's particularly popular and where there's a particular amount of evidence that this can be effective. And again, reframing these thoughts really matters because then this leads to different feelings and different behaviors. I might be more optimistic, I might feel better about myself, and maybe instead of procrastinating, I seek feedback from friends and colleagues like I'm doing here today. Now, how do people learn this type of skill currently? Often there's kind of worksheets and pieces of paper at the center of these type of exercises. The kind of in the right column here on this kind of almost empty sheet of paper, you see that there's these kind of empty text box to figure out an alternate thought. And maybe some of us are lucky and privileged that we have access to a therapist that can teach us these skills, work with us through these. Often you would still be alone at home, maybe with your therapy homework that might look like this type of worksheet. Or for really most people, they don't have access to anything other than maybe a PDF version or some digitized version of such a worksheet. And this is a really difficult task to do. As I mentioned, negative thoughts are often entrenched, automatic, emotionally triggering. They're difficult to overcome in the moment. And most of us do not have access to the few experts in the world that can really teach you these skills and provide the scaffolding practice and support. And sadly, mental health is still heavily stigmatized in too many places. So kind of these challenges led a wonderful organization called Mental Health America and our research team to be very interested whether we could develop some form of human AI collaboration that can provide more scaffolding that would make it easier to engage with these type of skills and would make this training more widely accessible. And I'll start by showing kind of a demo here of how this process works and reflect on where any AI interaction actually comes in. And this is very similar to these worksheets. And we start by a negative thought that we're struggling with right now. I'll share a hopefully somewhat relatable negative thought of I'll never achieve success as a researcher. You're probably not alone if you ever have that thought. And at the bottom here, you see what most people, kind of the most popular negative thoughts. And they're quite heavy and crushing, ranging from no one cares about me to I'm a failure to I'll never be able to do anything, I'm worthless, or I'm scared that something will happen to the people that I love. Those are some of the most commonly put in thoughts into the system. Next, we learned that it's really helpful to ask about a situation in which this thought came up. We do need to provide value to any user here pretty quickly, but to be useful, we really need to learn at least a minimum about you. And here we're learning a little bit about a little bit of context by figuring out what's the recent situation that led to this thought, like a recent paper rejection. And now we're starting to talk about thinking traps. That's our kind of attempt to be a little bit more accessible than cognitive restructuring or cognitive distortions. And in many ways, like we could all learn these skills in many different ways. For instance, you could read about 50 pages in a book, maybe learn about the 10 to 20 different types of thinking traps and learn to identify them. That can be a really tall ask for somebody who's going through something right now and wanting to use a tool. So the first way how any form of AI comes in is that we can analyze the thought and situation you bring up, and we can figure out what are some of the patterns that might be going on here. These are kind of types of cognitive distortions. And in some sense, you only need to learn about something that's immediately useful to you right now. And the other 19 classes or types of thoughts, maybe we can learn about a little bit later. So here, our models kind of assess that maybe there's overgeneralization, fortune telling, or all nothing thinking going on, all of which are true to some degree, and I can pick one to challenge specifically. And then the most difficult part for people and the most exciting parts, maybe from an AI perspective, is that we can suggest potential starting points to challenge these negative thoughts. So we call this a reframe. And here we actually intentionally generate multiple reframes in the hope that at least one of them is something you can really relate to. So I'll read some of them out. For instance, one says, rejection is a part of the process. I'll take the feedback I received and use it to improve my paper and submit again. Or it's normal to feel disappointed when something doesn't go as planned, and I can use this experience and learn and grow, and I'm sure I'll have more success in the future. And this is not meant to do your thinking for you. That's part of the actual kind of active ingredient and mechanism of this therapeutic process. But it's extremely difficult often to challenge your negative thoughts that perhaps have been reinforced by trauma for decades, and to even have a starting point of how you might think about this differently. And again, like I compare this to the status quo of doing these exercises, which are often pieces of paper that do not give the same affordances. They don't listen to you, adapt to you, respond to you, or give you specific feedback in the same ways. So after lots of systematic ethics and safety considerations, after ensuring high quality and safety, we actually deployed this model on a very popular mental health website called Mental Health America. It's available to everybody right now. So I'll also pop this QR code again on the last slide. But everybody can currently use this for free. And we've been extremely privileged that despite this actually being a bit hard to find sometimes, we've had over 160,000 people use this tool over the last about a year and a half. And it has allowed us to do dozens and dozens of randomized trials to really learn more about how to design these tools, how to improve these interventions themselves, and learn about the psychology behind it all. One thing that we learned pretty quickly and that got us more excited was that it really seemed to improve engagement by a lot. So this cognitive reframing that I introduced really is a very common skill. You might have heard of it before. Your I know, clinical psychology friends almost certainly have heard and exercised this before. And even this Mental Health America website, they actually had a tool that taught that already. That was just a digital version of one of these worksheets, essentially. And here I'm showing the completion rate, which was abysmal for the previous tool. It's truly a difficult thing to do, especially at the time when a lot of people seek to do it. And while far from perfect, seeing that kind of adding some of this AI support compared to kind of the previous tool, we saw at least much higher kind of engagement and completion rates. And one thing that really sticks with me is that we can actually already, even though we never optimized this for cost, we can already deliver these type of interventions at a cost that's actually lower than printing out a worksheet, even if no human has to even hand you this piece of paper. We can kind of deliver these type of interventions really for cents or fractions of a cent today. But it wasn't only more engaging. And kind of all the kind of numbers and results I will share are from proper randomized trials where, for instance, we found that a kind of a pixel by pixel identical version of this tool, just one without kind of AI support where you have to kind of find the starting point for a reframe yourself, people actually rated the ones with AI support as more helpful. They also rated higher that they were able to actually learn this skill in a meaningful way. We find that most of the time it helps people feel better within just a few minutes. Technically, this is not actually something that this intervention is designed to do. This is a deeply cognitive intervention that doesn't seek immediate kind of emotional outcomes, but it's nice to see that over 90% feel the same or better. But what was really interesting from maybe a more linguistic perspective is that we could learn kind of what actually makes particularly helpful reframes in a way that we couldn't do before, in part for a reason of measurement and scale. So for instance, people in psychotherapy have known for a really long time, like, what would a good reframe look like, an effective reframing? And they would say things as like, well, it really has to be relatable to the individual. It has to be helpful in overcoming this negative thought. And it should be memorable, because chances are you've had this thought before, and chances are this thought will arise again. So it's helpful if you can retrieve that and challenge that a little bit more easily the next time. What we didn't know, though, is how do you actually create reframes that are relatable and helpful and memorable? What does that actually mean, and how can a machine perhaps help you get there? So this led us, again, with lots of super awesome clinical psychology and mental health experts and people with lived experience, to start with various hypotheses of what might make things more relatable, more helpful, more memorable. And we came up with different constructs like, is something rational, actionable, or specific? Is it empathic? Is it positive? Is it readable? And then we developed natural language processing tools to measure exactly how actionable something is and how to make something more rational. And then we were able to, I showed you earlier, we always show you typically 3 alternatives, and then we can see what you click on and what do people actually rate the most helpful. With kind of appropriate randomization happening. And that allowed us to really inform psychological theory and learn more about how to create the most effective reframes. Here I'm showing you kind of by preference, I mean, is if I show you one of each of these 3 in a randomized order, what do people like to click on? What are the ones they actually want to start out with and use as this kind of starting point? People liked highly specific and empathic reframes. If things were simply more positive, that it was actually preferred less. So just kind of turning this negative thought into something overly positive, people clicked a lot less on. And at least on average across a highly varied population, there was some kind of medium complexity readability, like in terms of the complexity of the language, that worked best for this broad population. So this is what people click on. This next slide is about the outcomes that people report after going through this exercise. And we found that reframes that were more rational, that is, they make less assumptions about you and, for instance, about your social or financial resources. If we make less assumptions, that actually on average creates reframes that people find more relatable. We learned that actually working with this specific type of cognitive distortion or thinking trap, that people find this more helpful, and making things actionable and specific were perceived as more helpful as well. And finally, this actionable and specific were also the two constructs that seem to positively impact how likely people are to remember the type of reframe that they came up with. So this was exciting to see. At the same time, when we build any tools or systems, they often don't work for everybody equally well. And it's important to us that it works well for as many people as possible. So we did kind of a large study to really figure out who does this work for and who doesn't it work for. Many times we often find different performance, for instance, across lines of race and ethnicity. Here we actually, and I know these numbers are way too small to look at, even though I see some of you trying. The key takeaway here was actually that teenagers, people between 13 and 17, systematically reported much worse outcomes compared to the average. You also see this for kind of lower education levels, but the two are highly correlated. Now, we actually had started rolling this out to only adults after being even more confident about being able to provide a high enough quality and safety. We rolled this out to teenagers. But this is actually a really important target demographic for the organization we work with, and teenage and adolescent mental health. It's really something that has gotten worse and worse over recent years. So we tried to figure out what can we actually do to make this better. And one thing we eventually found out is that the types of reframes that younger folks were putting in tended to be a lot kind of less complex sentences, like in terms of reading level or sentence complexity, however you want to define that. They had the shortest sentences and the shortest words in their reframes. So we made the kind of not too complex step from that and said, it's like, well, what if we make our reframes that we suggest also a little bit kind of simpler and more casual? So we did an experiment where we kept everything the same, and then we just had another language model rewrite this to make it a bit easier to understand and more casual. And we actually saw kind of significant improvements, again, in randomized trials here with 13 to 14-year-olds, where we see that after this very simple treatment and something that language models can do to a decent degree, they actually found those reframes to be significantly more relatable, significantly more helpful without impacting any other outcomes negatively. Kind of seeing kind of everything I've shown so far comes from these kind of larger scale online deployments. We're grateful with some funding from the NIH. We were able to do a proper pre-registered clinical trial of some of this technology, where we had people, paid people to keep using these tools for 4 weeks and gathering lots of different outcomes along the way. And while we weren't kind of shocked given the prior findings, it was good to see that in a proper pre-registered clinical trial, we did see that kind of reframes with the AI tools were often more effective. And we found that people that were randomized to the kind of with AI group use the tool more often. And while we can't prove that, we think that if people have a better experience earlier, when it's especially difficult to do this skill, this additional scaffolding that makes reframes more effective actually just makes them want to use the tool a little bit more. In this digital mental health world, engagement is really a holy grail, where many people would say, it's like, we have all these things we think that would really help you if people just did them. But it turns out it's really hard to actually do that and to sustain that use. And the last thing I want to share for this kind of first skill is we also did this longer term trial to take the training wheels off. What we did is the first 4 weeks, we asked everybody to use the tool at least 3 times. And then we measured, this is a complex composite measure here on the y-axis that essentially measures things like skill use and skill mastery. So subscales here would include, I caught myself thinking negatively, recognized the negative bias and reevaluated the situation, or I caught myself thinking in an irrational way and I actively worked to develop more rational views. So it's people's agreements with those type of it's kind of a well-established and validated scale. And what we do find after we take we do ask about this when people use the skill outside the tool. And then after another 4 weeks, after 8 weeks total, when people haven't seen this tool and used this tool for at least 4 weeks, we ask again, and we see that kind of this improvement in this cognitive reframing skill is sustained at least for another 4 weeks. So even when we take some of these training wheels off, people seem to be able to apply the skill a little bit better in their own lives. Next, I want to change gears to a second skill that is about conflict resolutions and having difficult conversations. Turns out that really many important conversations we all need to have are often quite difficult. Maybe you have an aging parent and you're thinking through healthcare options. Maybe a friend hurt your feelings. Maybe you're negotiating a salary. Maybe you're advising a PhD student going through something. There's lots and lots and lots of examples of difficult conversations. And these are all difficult for multiple reasons. Many times we're not trained in how to really best have this specific type of conversations. We're not quite sure on the best strategies, how to start them or how to express our needs clearly. And then there's this emotional component that often comes in the way, where even people that in principle are pretty good at these type of communication strategies, when strong emotions come up, they can get in the way, or we are kind of very attached to the outcome of the conversations, and that kind of make it even more difficult to have these conversations effectively. And not too different with kind of other mental health related skills. You can learn the skill. There's professionals that might teach you these skills. It just turns out there's few such professionals. Few people have access to them. It's often out of reach for most people. But what these experts would do is they would often simulate those difficult conversations with you and provide just-in-time feedback. What most people have access to are maybe some free web resources, worksheets, maybe lists of conversation strategies, maybe worksheets to practice something. But it's not quite the same fidelity as if you kind of could really practice conversations like that more regularly. So one of these paths is effective, but not accessible. The other one is more accessible, but not particularly effective. And we tried to use kind of language model technology and develop that it could perhaps provide both. So this work was led by my PhD student, Ina Lim. She called her system Imbue, which was this interactive training system backed by language model that will simulate difficult conversations, provide just-in-time feedback to support both the kind of conversation strategy as well as these emotional regulation components to having those conversations well. I won't go into a crazy amount of detail, but there's, I really love about the psychology work that people have thought about for decades and decades how to teach these specific skills. And they have developed effective frameworks for how to do that. And we attach to a particular one called Dear Man framework in dialectical behavioral therapy. As the name fails to suggest, this is a gender-neutral framework for how to have conversations, and it has specific sub-skills, like how to describe the facts of the situations without judgment, to express your emotions using I statements, to assert and clearly state what you need to and want, and so on. And I'll show a pre-recorded demo. It'll be a little bit harder to see because we actually built this for a desktop rather than a mobile use, but I'll read out the important components. I just want to give you an understanding of the flow of how this skill practice looks like. So we start with the situation. Anybody can come and share the kind of conversation they're dreading about having that they find difficult. Here we're having a situation where my dad has difficulty remembering to take his medication. I'm considering to hire a nurse to take care of him. he disagrees, thinks it doesn't need help. And my goal here could, for instance, be is to convince them to kind of accept this assistant into their life to help with their healthcare. It starts out with getting a suggestion for a skill. We might not know how to start here at all. And even though kind of one good way is maybe to describe the facts of the situation. So we can then choose what skill do we actually want to express, and we'll select exactly, we'll select here which type of skill we want to express. And here we just follow the recommendation of using this describe skill. I now get to exercise that and write out kind of a first conversation, turn, or utterance using this strategy. Let's see, I'll come up with, you kept forgetting to take your meds. It's so bad for your health. And now we can get some specific feedback. And I'll talk about the quality of this feedback in a few minutes. Here, for instance, we give feedback to improve the objectivity. For instance, kind of adding an emotional statement, it's so bad for your health, is maybe not the best to do. And finally, then the user can kind of make changes to their original message based on this feedback. And then here on the right-hand side, we have this ongoing conversation where we can simulate this conversation partner for kind of deliberate practice purposes. Now, there's multiple components to this system. On the one hand, we have this simulation of a participant-provided communication scenario. We also kind of ask questions about your conversation partner. So if they're particularly stubborn or whatever kind of might make it more challenging to have this conversation, we try to simulate here. And then on the other hand, we have this ideally expert-like just-in-time feedback where there's two components to the feedback we give. One is to help advise you kind of what skill do you want to use next? Like what's a good strategy to kind of respond to whatever conversational context we're at? And then to give feedback on the skill use and give concrete actionable advice to perhaps avoid judgmental language or words like constantly, and to stick to the facts to kind of allow us to have a constructive conversation with kind of a much higher likelihood. Now, from a computational perspective, that essentially means these two tasks. We want to, given a situation, a previous utterance, and a skill somebody wants to express, we want to simultaneously rate how well they did that and generate an improvement. So here, for instance, if I say you constantly forget to take your meds, it's so bad for your health, we might point out this judgmental language or often not so helpful language like words like constantly and kind of sticking more to the facts. And we can also, given a situation, however somebody else responded, help you figure out what's a good strategy to continue to have this conversation, which is this kind of discrete skill suggestion. Now, of course, we had to collect lots of data to do this well. We worked both with lay people, the kind of target population where we are curious about what are difficult situations and conversations in real life that you encounter, that you're uncomfortable about having, that you avoid having, that you dread having. And we want to have a good understanding of the type of scenarios that can come up for people. And then we worked with experts in this dialectical behavioral therapy framework that do this with their clients regularly in terms of collecting data of what particularly high quality versions of this practice and feedback would look like. And I won't go into all the technical details here, but feel free to ask me later. I also won't go into kind of all the automatic aspects of the evaluation. And in many ways, I mostly can just caution about many of our current methods to automatically evaluate these type of things. They kind of failed to capture what we found kind of through human expert evaluation in dramatic ways. So the one thing I have circled here is human experts deciding something along the lines of, is the feedback that either a GPT-4 baseline or a system that has a few bells and whistles, how often kind of does this feedback express about the same at what the kind of clinical expert would have said. How often you actually match that feedback. This was only happening 6% of the time for, I know, a decent general language model, but it actually happened 83% of the time after we added several bells and whistles that involve ideas like retrieval augmented generation, chain of thought, specific contrasting pairs of showing what are particularly good and not so good ways to exercise skills. And while the automatic metrics here to the right tended to show in the right direction, it was nowhere near as significant. And personally, I trust in kind of these human expert evaluations a lot more. Now, we also did a randomized trial to really see, oh, there's a question. Go ahead.
Yeah, I had a question on this table. So what is the second line, which is without contrasting pair?
Yeah, so many times kind of few shot learning, context learning approaches, you would just include a few examples, and that's very commonly done. And this contrasting pair was, I think, one of the more unique bells and whistles we added, where this contrasting pair shows not only how to do something, like not only a single example and a rating, oh, here's a particularly bad way of doing a describe, but always to show for the same situation, here's a kind of not so great way and a contrasting, much better way of doing. And having kind of both of these present in the context significantly improved the quality of the feedback.
Thank you so much. So helpful.
Yeah, so it's essentially kind of multiple related data points to much better communicate what the contrast of better skill expression looks like. And thank you for that question. So now we're going to talk about a randomized trial where we try to, I know the proof is always in the pudding. So we were curious, do people actually learn the skill? And what does it take to learn the skill? And we worked with about 80 or so people. They were either assigned to just the simulation only condition or the simulation plus feedback condition. We also have pre and post ways of measuring skills that I'll get into a second. And we asked people to give two different difficult situations, kind of conversations that you dread having, are uncomfortable having, possibly avoid having. And on a 9-point Likert scale, we kind of worked with situations that were 7s, 8s, and 9s. And so here's the kind of flow of the study. So each participant that stated two situations that were particularly difficult, we'll call the less difficult, the slightly easier but still difficult one, the situation 1. And they also give a more difficult one we hold out for now. We then ask a bunch of questions about how uncomfortable are you about having these conversations, what emotions that elicits. And we simulate only for the first conversation, basically to see how good are you at having these conversations prior to any training. Then the training happens, and here I'm showing us the training wheel. So now there's kind of two randomized conditions. Either you have the simulation only or the simulation plus feedback condition. And you do this on the first situation, and we can measure how well you do this with the training wheels on. And then we intentionally take the training wheels off. First, we'll have that same conversation scenario again. And we evaluate kind of your skill use as well as emotional responses. And then finally, we take this holdout second situation to see whether this actually generalizes to a different scenario. And you're having these conversations without any feedback again. How we care about evaluating this, we do this from various perspectives. We care about, do you actually master the skills that you might have been lacking previously? Does it reduce difficult negative emotions that are pretty common to have in these scenarios? And do you feel confident in your ability to have these conversations constructively? For the first one, we use validated machine learning models that we built. The other two, we are based on self-report from our participants. So now we'll go through these three one by one, and we'll start by skill mastery. So here on the x-axis, S means simulation only, and S plus F is simulation and feedback. And the y-axis is the difference kind of post versus before the training. And what we see here is that the simulation alone didn't improve kind of skill mastery, skill expression, skill use. But the condition where people also had feedback improved this by about 17%. You can also break it down into the sub-skills, and you really find that both the conversational skills as well as the emotional skills both seem to be improved, but only significantly improved in the condition where people actually have feedback as well. Next, I'm going to talk about emotion reduction, and we focus on primary negative emotions, anger, fear, sadness, disgust. So for instance, we figure about like how angry are you kind of about the situation. And here's what we find. Here we actually do find that the simulation only condition already helps reduce these kind of negative emotional responses, for instance, for fear and sadness, about 25 and 17% respectively. But we do find that actually adding the feedback to it reduces it significantly more, here about 41%. However, for anger specifically, we found actually that at least our study was not powered to a degree that it significantly reduced anger, and only the feedback condition helped people also be less angry about the situation. Number 3 was about your self-efficacy, your confidence. How confident are you, or how worried are you about the situation? How hopeful are you that you can have this in a meaningful way? How motivated are you to actually have this conversation? And here's what we find. Again, we find that simulation alone helps some degree, on the order of like 17 and 27% to improve confidence and reduce worry. Again, we find that adding feedback helps significantly more, going from 17 to 44%. And then for 2 other measures around hopefulness and motivation, those were only significant in the context of our roughly 80-person study when feedback was present. So to summarize, we tried to build the system to really provide scaffolding and deliberate practice and constructive feedback. And at least 80% we can do this with quality that's about equivalent to kind of the world experts in this domain. This happens to be something that's developed at UW. So we had relative ease in recruiting people that really know how to apply the skill. All we did was a single session of training. That doesn't necessarily mean that that's potent enough to really enact drastic change, but we found that skill use and emotions were improved after just a single session. Really, the best outcomes happened from both simulation and feedback, even though some emotional regulation outcomes, even just going through this before and I know being with your emotions can already help to some degree decrease these negative emotional outcomes. Now, I usually talk a lot more in these talks about, I think, extremely important ethical and safety considerations. I kept that shorter today in order to show you some of the most recent work I'm very excited about. But of course, in this world of technology and mental health, there's not only opportunities, but also risk. I think one of the most important things we could do was to really co-design these systems with all the various stakeholders from the beginning, which is not how I've always done research, but I don't know how to do without anymore. We do operationalize existing bioethics frameworks that are principle-based in a variety of different ways. And if anybody's interested, I'm happy to talk more about that. Of course, there's minimum requirements of consent and IRB review. But among other things, we're also forming kind of flagging and filtering inappropriate and unsafe content, both through automatic means as well as giving users agencies to flag and tell us about things that are below bar. And we perform some version of collaborative stress testing or red teaming before we put this in front of anybody. This will be my last slide, and I'll be brief. I'm super excited for the opportunities to challenge people using AI and help us learn important skills. Earlier work that I didn't talk about focused a lot on how we can help people express empathy more effectively. We're currently working on clinician-patient interactions and a particular difficult scenario where your clinician actually makes a mistake and you get harmed in the process, and the clinician has to explain that, take accountability, and move forward in the care process. Something that's particularly difficult and clinicians are typically not trained to do. In other projects, we're trying to teach critical thinking and fact-checking skills around misinformation and polarization. And we're also exploring some more creative tasks in collaboration with some kind of Reddit communities around photography. So this is all I wanted to share. I think we have about 7 minutes for questions. I'll keep my summary here very short, but I will say we're so grateful for the amazing mental health professionals and people with lived experience of mental health we get to work with. Really, without them, we wouldn't be able to do any of this. Some of the tools and insights, some of which I showed today, are now actually used at several organizations serving about 10 million people total, and that means the world to us. The people that made all this work happen are these wonderful faces, and let me specifically highlight Ashish Sharma, who led the first project I shared today, and Inalin, another PhD student who shared the second one. Thanks for the invitation again, and I look forward to the Q&A.
All right, thank you. As you mentioned, we have some time for discussion. Let's see, I'm going to remove your spotlight so that we can bring those folks on. I think Tim, you're welcome to drive the conversation. Maybe if you stop screen sharing, then we can see folks. Looks like there's a question.
Yeah. Hi, Tim. Thanks for sharing. It's such inspiring work, really. So I was wondering, it seems like a lot of your work is kind of taking things that have been done with human supervision and that are done better with human supervision, and then using LLMs to kind of make it more scalable and accessible to people. And I was just curious if you've given any thought to, in these domains that you're looking at, and actually particularly in the reframing domain, because this is my area of study, so I'm particularly interested, if you've given any thought to like how to leverage LLMs in unique ways that you maybe you could do more than what you could do with a human, if you have any ideas towards like using those affordances that LLMs have that people don't.
Yeah. That's a great question. In many ways, like, yes, we often think about things that are done with people, and we think about how can we make this broadly accessible. But this is not exactly a question, but I use it as an opportunity to point out mental health really is a world in which the person that this technology could replace doesn't exist in the first place most of the time. It's really a world where kind of the supply and demand are massively far from each other. So while we often, and especially the larger scale deployments that we've done, focus on kind of human-AI collaboration in the sense that the client or patient or user is collaborating with an AI tool, I don't think that any of this should or at least in the near term will replace traditional mental health care systems. At the same time, those are so absolutely and massively under-resourced that even in the US, about 80% of people that absolutely need care will have access to absolutely no care. And that's kind of the world where we think about these tools as this kind of at least a minimum level of psychoeducation and mental health care access that we all really need. To really come to your question about kind of the unique affordances, and I especially bring this up when in that same conversation, we find all the time that some people either kind of, they might respond to us with gratitude and say things like, I don't have a single person in my life that I'm comfortable sharing this with. We also find people that are privileged to have access to a therapist, and they will share things like, actually, this has been really useful. I don't feel comfortable sharing this with my therapist because I'm so worried about what they will think about me, how awful of a person I am, etc. Where even people that have the kind of rare access to professionals that could help them, there's I don't know, complex emotions and stigma and trauma involved in a way where working kind of with a not perceived as human AI tool can really give access to some people that are not currently well served by the system. That's definitely one of them. One that we haven't kind of leveraged as much, or actively working on it, and I think is really exciting, is how we can continue to adapt these tools over a longer period of time, and when people reuse them over and over again. So if you're, very few people have the immense privilege that they have access to a therapist even over longer periods of time, and that therapist will get to know you better, have a case file, adapt things, and be able to be more and more useful over time. And that's really something where I want these kind of learning tools to go, that they get better with every time you use them, which will require some form of kind of state and memory to kind of, if I understand what some of your core beliefs are, for what some of your triggers and traumas might have been, like, we should be able to provide even more value quicker. And this is a really critical thing. And like I think among all the kind of affordances or the value we can provide here, really important, people's behavior inside traditional clinical studies where they're paid and in the real world tends to be quite different from each other and present different challenges. And what we find is that especially engagement and providing enough value quickly enough that people really sustain kind of the engagement, finish the exercises and so on, is super, super difficult. And the most fundamental way I can come up with really breaking this kind of intense tension is to remember things about you, to be even more useful, even quicker, and to take some of the kind of friction and barriers away.
Thank you.
All right, thanks, Tim. Maybe one quick one. I'm curious, how do we know when to take the training wheels off? Like, how do you avoid dependence?
Yeah, how do we know when to take the training wheels off? Mostly, I don't know how to answer this question, and I believe it's a good one. I think one thing how we study this question and try to getting to the answer is, for instance, in the first training wheel where I showed this 4 to 8 week difference where we took the training wheels off, we actually kind of all throughout people's engagement with the tool, and when we're collecting outcomes, we're intentionally collecting both outcomes inside the tool and outside the tool. So we're trying to characterize really how well is your with training wheel and without training wheel performance, collect that data longitudinally, to be able to assess when do we start to see the first increases without training wheels. And that could, for instance, inform when it is time, how to kind of really systematically assess this. Right now, it's really just a lot of kind of measurement, gathering outcomes, both with and without training tools. I'll quickly try to go back. So far, I wish there was kind of a more like a more obvious phase shift that would make it really clear. Oh, like this is how it works. This is when you can take the training wheels off, but not before. What we've seen was fairly continuous. In this first study around cognitive reframing, we saw that people got and this is outside tool, no training wheel performance as reported using validated scales, but self-reported from the patient. We saw it kind of increase for the first 3 weeks. And then in the 4th week, the performance did not increase further. So at least in this kind of very specific scenario where we tried to collect data to inform that, and where we frankly did an educated guess of how long we want people to practice this with the tool, we arrived at 4 weeks. We actually didn't see like we saw an increase from week 2 to week 3, but not from week 3 to week 4. Thankfully, we saw 8 weeks later that it was at the same level rather than plummeting down. So if there was kind of no real retention of that skill, that's what we would expect. Like if we're overdoing the support and the training wheels. At least for the specific skill, it seemed like training for 3 weeks was worth it. And the 4th week, we're not sure. But kind of how to really synthesize and generalize that much more broadly, I think is very much work in progress, and an important question.
All right, I look forward to it. Then I'll thank Tim one more time for joining us today. Congratulations on the great work, and looking forward to your next steps.
Yeah, really appreciate the invitation and all the questions.
Yeah, with that, I will close the seminar and cut off the recording. Thanks all, and I hope you have a wonderful Friday and weekend. See you later.
Take care, everybody.